Shabbat Shalom, everybody. We get to talk about one of my favorite things.
Seriously?
I love it.
Okay.
Hence the book.
Yeah.
So we have a double portion this week. So we're going to be doing Leviticus 12 through 15. And then next week, we get Yom Kippur, which Kenny's going to teach, which is the high point of the Torah. So we're reaching the climax of all the goodness that the Torah and Leviticus have to offer us. So these two portions are very interesting, covering the topics of different types of purification and giving us definition for things that make us or made the Israelites unclean, and how to deal with that. So these are always interesting topics to talk about. There's a lot of detail, particularly about Zarat, which is translated in many modern translations as leprosy, which is not accurate, but skin disease. So we might just use the term skin disease. It could be a type of disease, a specific disease. There's a lot of discussion about exactly what this disease is, but the point is that it's a problem and it has to be properly diagnosed and dealt with. So we won't probably get too far into that. So we've got all these different categories of, and we also have a little section on the purification of a house, and there's different fabrics and different materials basically that can also be unclean, which is really interesting. So ultimately, where I want us to get is where we're heading. The direction that we're heading this morning is toward how Yeshua actually deals with some of these topics. So I have this book, which I have not read all of, but it's been on my shelf for a couple of years, and I finally pulled it out this week, called Jesus and the Forces of Death. So, which is a catching title. And the subtitle is The Gospel's Portrayal of Ritual Impurity Within First Century Judaism. So he's basically dealing with the ideas. I like this. I've heard this theologian speak, and he's kind of spicy, which I like. I find that really fun. And he is this book is basically looking into how Yeshua interacts with these different purity laws in the Gospels. And the argument is set up, which is not necessarily the argument that we necessarily need in our context, but the argument is set up to clarify and to come against some of the understanding of that, it's kind of an antiquated system that was just for the temple, and when Yeshua came, it took away all of that, and he's against it, and all these things, and so we are not needing that argument necessarily, but still how the perspectives that he brings in this book, from what I've read so far, which is only a few sections, is really interesting, and it helps to bring a really cohesive understanding of how and why the purity laws function in the tabernacle and the temple periods, as well as how Yeshua interacts with them in a way that is congruent with how they were originally established, but also brings a greater fullness, because that's what Yeshua does with the Torah. So that's where we're gonna kind of end. That's where my hope is. That's where we're gonna end up, is kind of talking about how Yeshua interacts with some of these things. But before we get there, I want to talk about a couple other things. So, but before we do that, back to this point about how Yeshua, I like this quote. This is from the introduction of this book. And Matthew Thiessen is the theologian that wrote it. He says, modern readers of the gospel will not rightly understand Jesus apart from the more thorough comprehension of ancient Jewish and non-Jewish ritual purity concerns, precisely because these purity concerns map out the reality of the world as the gospel writers conceived it. So he's basically saying, like, the gospel writers and the early believers were living in this context. So they're understanding Yeshua within that context, and therefore it's helpful for us to understand it because it helps us understand what he's saying. So that's where we're heading. But before we get there, we've had some of this discussion before, but I always think it's worth revisiting about what the ritual purity laws really are, why they are, the definitions, and how we and making sure that we properly define and understand what they are and their role, because I've said this many times, and I keep coming back to this, I think, because I want a greater grasp on it, is that being impure does not automatically equal sin. You can sin in your state of impurity, but being impure, ritually impure, is not sinful in and of itself. So the first chapter of this book actually kind of deals with this framework, and he actually looks at it from 4 categories that we have. The holy and the profane, which we're going to define profane in a second, and then we have pure and impure. So that's 4 categories that kind of work in pairs. So you can kind of pair them all together, but and also holy and pure are not synonymous, and neither are necessarily profane and impure. But let's define profane for a second. So the TLV actually uses, so this is like looking back to Leviticus, I think it's 10:10. Let me see. Yeah. So Leviticus 10:10 is the verse that says you are to make a distinction between the holy and the common, and between the clean and the unclean. So the TLV translation says holy and common, but many translations of the Bible say between the holy and the profane, which when we hear the word profane, we think profanity, right? We think foul language, we think really negatively. But when basically the definition, that's not how the definition should be understood. Which is why I actually like that the TLV uses common, because I think that's a little bit more helpful for our modern brains to understand. But basically the word profane is coming from just meaning outside the temple, which just means secular or common use, right? It's really not this good or bad thing. It's just that there's holy and there's outside of holy, right? Like there's the temple or the tabernacle, and there's everywhere else in some sense. And so it just refers to something that is outside of holy. And then the other sense of like, the other example is that like when we think of the days of the week, we have 6 days that are common, or this would use the word profane, but that doesn't mean they're bad, right? So this is how I'm trying to demonstrate this point. And then we have the Sabbath, the 7th day, that is holy, right? It's set apart. It's a different day. So we have that contrast. Do you have something to say, Lori?
Well, yeah.
You look like you're thinking.
Yeah, well, I was thinking like even with the holy and common, it's like even dish sets, okay? Like I have the ones that are in my china cabinet that only get pulled out for very special occasions. They're hand washed, they're treated special. Right. And then I have the ones that are in the regular cabinet that get thrown in the dishwasher, and we let the dog lick it. I mean, it's like,
exactly.
So there's the before they go to the dishwasher, yeah. So you do, there's the things that you set apart for special use, holy, and then the stuff that's common, which my regular dishes aren't profane; they're just my common everyday dishes. So.
Right. And if we think about it too, if we think about, again, days of the week, certain places, certain items, most of the things and time in the world, it fits in the category of the profane or the common, right? I think it also, to try to break this, sometimes this construct that builds in our minds of like, that one is better than the other. It's not meant to be one is good as one is bad. It's meant to be one is holy and one is not. And we live most of our lives in the common. So that doesn't inherently mean that it's that it's bad. Can there be evil and can there be bad in their sin? Of course. But it doesn't mean that just because it's not a holy place, a holy time, a holy item, means that it's bad. Faith, did you have something?
Would you equate that with God calling the Jewish people his holy set apart people?
Yeah.
Versus the common who could be grafted in.
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, I think, because again, and it fits this principle as well too, right? The Jewish people are a very small percentage of the people on the earth, right? Most of the earth is filled with Gentiles. Does that mean that Gentiles are bad? No, it just means that we're not Jewish. And so you carry that. You end up carrying that out of being grafted in and being welcomed into the family. And our understanding is that doesn't mean that Gentiles are required to take on the entire law that is specifically given to the Jewish people and are meant to live Jewish lives. Though we are called to live alongside the Jewish people and support and live as brothers and sisters. But it doesn't mean that we're all meant to be this one homogenous group, that we all necessarily live our lives exactly the same way. So there is still distinction. It's this unity with distinction principle in some sense, yeah.
And of course, we didn't even have the teaching of holy and common and clean and unclean until we had the tabernacle in our midst, and we had the Lord dwelling in that tabernacle, and it was so much about not defiling his sacred space.
Right.
And so, being common, unclean, or whatever in your household, giving birth.
Right.
The normal daily stuff that went on, they weren't calling those people sinners. It was just when you're in a state of uncleanness,
right,
or if you haven't brought yourself to a place of holiness, you don't approach the presence of the Lord in that state.
Right.
And again, it was just about not defiling sacred space.
Right. Unto what?
Unto relationship with him.
Right. Right? It's the whole goal of this entire system is not about who can keep the law the best.
Right.
It's about we want the presence of God dwelling in our midst. And so in that sense it becomes, and we've talked about this a little bit before, it's this idea that it's like, again, like, yeah, if you are, well, let's get into, before let me pause for a second there. So because we have these, we've kind of crossed over a little bit. We have these pure and impure dynamics. So we have holy and common, and we have pure and impure. And so the pure and impure is basically defined in the Torah and by some of these chapters that we're looking at today. And again, being impure doesn't mean sin. It can lead you to sin if you don't deal with it properly, but being impure, because again, some of these things that make you impure, you have no control over, right? Women have no control over their cycle. Of course we want children to be born. So these are not bad things. And yet they put you in a state of impurity, and how you manage that or how you deal with that, I guess, has an impact on some of these things. So there's this idea. So if we want God to be dwelling in our midst, and thinking in the tabernacle period especially, they have God dwelling in their midst, right? So they have this sacred space because something cannot be holy and unholy at the same time. So we have these categories, but you can't be in both of the pair really at the same time. So we have the tabernacle as like this ultimate holy space, and it can be profaned or damaged, I guess you could say, when something unholy or impure comes into it. And God, who is the source of all holiness, is the one who is dwelling in the tabernacle. So the whole goal is God's presence. And so what I was going to say earlier is so when we look at purity, it's like, yeah, we're not looking at a person who's in a state of impurity as being sinful, and yet they are responsible for how they act in that, of not knowingly going into holy space in a state of impurity, because ultimately, if the tabernacle is defiled and that holy space is defiled, then God can't dwell there. So I kind of look at it as, if, and sometimes we have this view of like, well, God loves everyone. He wants everybody to come. And that's sometimes the juxtaposition that people set. And we're going to get into a little bit more of that when we look at some of the, how Yeshua interacts with some of this, of that there's this idea that, this temple system is really rigid and it keeps people away from God, and Yeshua is compassionate and he wants everybody to come in. Well, but the reality is, when we look at that ends up being a very individualistic perspective, right? Which is, we are quite prone to the very individualistic mindset. So, but when you think of it as a whole, like, you have to have this perspective that if God is dwelling in the midst of Israel, you still want God's presence to be dwelling in the tabernacle or the temple for the whole community, right? So your own personal inability to enter into that space for a period of time, which is very often, depending on which situation we're talking about, is as little as one day. Sometimes is longer in situations such as childbirth or some of those things, but your own personal inability to enter that should not override the fact that we want God to dwell in the midst of all the people, right? So it becomes this community observance, so this corporate observance. And again, I like to say too, one of the things I love about Torah is that no one person can keep the Torah by themselves. No, it's impossible. Right? Because there are instructions given to specific people. And also with this pure and impure thing, you have people, anybody at any given time is not going to be able to go in. But there are always people who are, right? So there's people who are able to go in and minister, to offer the sacrifices, to complete the sacrificial systems and things like that. And there are people who have to stay away. And there's something really beautiful about that, is that it's not all on one person. And like I've said before, it's like it also becomes the responsibility for the community and the people around the high priest and the priesthood, who have some even specific purity laws for them, to help maintain their sense of purity, their state of purity, right? Because they have specific things they have to do. So it actually is, a corporate observance. It's not so individualistic that it's just about me and my ability to go in, or my ability, or whatever. So I think it's good to look at that bigger framework, because I think it's important. But also back to this idea of compassion. Because also there's this idea that there's this safeguard, right? Like when we look at, like, was it last week's portion or 2 weeks? It was last week's portion. That we have the unauthorized or the strange fire, right? And they're from Aaron's sons, and they're put to death, right? So God is powerful, right? Holiness is powerful. I think I gave a drash one time that was called, the title was Holiness is Dangerous. And that story of Aaron's sons offering the unauthorized fire is that example of, it's dangerous. So in some sense, there's these boundaries or these parameters set around how you enter for protection. So I actually so again, like, there's this juxtaposition sometimes that, this system is really legalistic and it's really strict and it's keeping people away sometimes and whatever. And then Yeshua is compassionate and he draws everybody in. But this system is actually pretty compassionate. So I like this. So again, from this same book, he says that I would suggest that compassion animates the Jewish purity system. It was a protective and benevolent system intended to preserve God's presence among his people, a presence that could be of considerable danger to humans if they approached God wrongly. So again, the Torah, Leviticus, all of the law, the whole, how I would summarize all of it is God saying, I want to be with you. Do you want to be with me? And again, it goes beyond our own individual personal desires or even state of being and looks at the corporate, right? Unto being a light to the nations, unto this being this, Israel being this example nation of showing how to worship and honor God and also just to have God dwelling in their midst. So I'll pause there for a second. So especially on this idea of the compassion, I guess, or if anybody has comments on anything we've talked about so far, that's fine too. Yeah, but even this idea of like, do you see this system, this not sacrificial system, I guess that too, but this system of, or this idea of pure and impure, do you see the compassion in that? Do you see the kindness of God in it? Or does it feel like this strict legalistic system? Yeah.
So, growing up with church ideas where relations, will keep it PG, I guess, can be viewed as highly sinful. Reading this, it says that if she cannot afford a lamb, she is to bring 2 doves or 2 young, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. Verse 8 of 12.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious as to the sin offering.
So, yeah, this is an interesting one because, and I don't have the Tom's handout cheat sheet in front of me, but it's like Lori probably has it. So there's some different definitions, and it is interesting, and it is in some sense I don't know that we have a full explanation. Other than it is just that he requires certain things. I'm trying to remember. I feel like there is another aspect of that, and I can't remember how it's worded. Yeah.
Okay, sin is also purification.
Thank you. I was like, there's another way that they have it worded on there, and I could not come up with the word. So yeah, okay.
Yeah, so with her losing blood, having had a child, it wasn't that she was in sin.
Mm.
It was basically the loss of blood, and life is in the blood.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so whenever there was a loss of blood, whether it was during her cycle or having a baby, there was a purification offering that came up, because even though she had a baby, there was still this bloodshed type of thing. So even though our Bibles might translate that as a sin offering, what she was doing is a purification offering because she had discharged blood.
Mm.
So yeah, he's not calling that sin.
Concluded, it's just with certain denominations that take very legalistic actions when it comes to certain things, and I can see how that can be bent, and I'm like, bleed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, because another thing to think about too, so I would also say, like, really, for the most part, whenever any sin offering is it's about purification, because there's actually not an offering for intentional sin. So basically any sin, and again, purification is the better understanding here, and it gets lumped into the one category. But whether we're talking about purification from a situation like this with childbirth, or we're talking about sin, it's understood that it's unintentional and there's purification, but it's meant to feel the weight of what's happening. And we'll talk about some of the broader understanding of and why this book is called Jesus and the Forces of Death, and why some of this ritual purity is often defined as having to do with life versus death. But regardless, I think the category is better understood as purification, because it's not meant to be, oh, I knowingly and intentionally went and committed this sin, and I'm going to offer this sin offering and everything's fine. It's not meant to be for intentional sin. It's all meant to be about unintentional sin, which I think helps make it line up a little bit more easily with a purity context, whereas we're just looking at purification, because sin, again, is something that would make you, I guess, is connected with impurity, even though not being impure is not always sinful, but sin does make you impure. That makes sense. Yeah.
I guess the way I'm trying to describe it is that the whole relationship thing between God and his creation is redemption.
Mm-hmm.
And the earth and humans and everything, all of his creation is heading towards death. And he's all about restoring, redeeming, bringing life.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though these different impure situations are not sin, they are pointing towards death, that we're born and like life is in the blood and it's spilled, so it's pointing towards death. And there's all these things that are pointing towards where we're headed is death. But God is about redeeming that and bringing to life. And so it's connected to sin in a sense that the wages of sin is death. That's why we're headed towards death.
Mm-hmm.
But the acts of having a baby or menstrual period, all these things are not sin, but they kind of point towards the fact that we're headed towards death. And God is all about redemption, about life.
Mm-hmm.
And so we really promote life, even though you've got all these sacrifices that are about death, obviously.
Right.
And so it's this connection between life and death and sin. And so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, go ahead, Faith.
Since he's brought up the blood issue and the woman, I actually have in the margin, as I read through this week, the woman with the issue of blood, healed and cleansed, how related, with a question mark. And now that we're talking about it, I'll just throw out what's coming to mind. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe I was going to actually ask you, or ask whoever was teaching, what do you think? But it strikes me, just like Jim is saying, God's heart is to restore.
Mm-hmm.
And that woman with that issue of blood could not come into community.
Right.
And not that it was anything she had control over, except
Right.
she had faith to know that he could restore her. And
Right.
just like you say, this is all pointing to Yeshua. In every case, he is able
Yeah.
to pronounce clean or unclean or
Yeah.
make a way.
Yeah. Which we're gonna stick a pin in it for just a second. We'll come back to it.
I figured, yeah.
But I do want to talk about that. I just want to make sure I get a couple other things in first. So I will come back, I promise. Because but also thinking about her, I will say this about that situation is like thinking about her, and that I don't remember exactly how it's worded. I'd have to go look at it. But it talks about her, she is living apart, right? So in that sense, she's also demonstrating this principle of she knows she's unclean. She has to stay away, which is a really lonely, terrible existence, right? But she understands the importance of not defiling the holy place or making someone unclean who needs to go into all these things. And so she's carrying out that. Which I think is also part of, but we're going to talk about too, because that's the story. Like it talks about like that he, like he feels the power go out of him, but we're going to come back to that. So we're going to stick a pin in that one for a second. We'll come back. But back to this, I want to come back to this idea, this life and death aspect of this. So the common way that these categories, I guess you could say, of ritual impurity are categorized are about death, which we think, when you think, how is childbirth about death, which Jim has been kind of talking about a little bit, we're going to talk about a little bit more about it, or how is even a couple, coming together, like, it's like, that's how you get the child, right? So it's like, how can some of these things be considered death? And this is an interesting idea, and this is kind of just saying in a different way what Jim was already saying. Is that there's this aspect of the fact that humans are born and die that means that we kind of live, it sounds weird, we live in the cycle of death, right? And God is immortal, right? God is the uncreated creator, right? So he does not die and was not born. So this cycle of birth and death is all connected, right? So there's this idea that if a being is born and dies, then all of these actions are still part of this cycle of death, which sounds really morbid, but that's how they're kind of explaining it. And that's why they're saying, if a couple comes together and they don't have a baby, that's the opportunity, and that died. Or a woman having her cycle that's because there's no baby, so there's death associated with that. So that's where this kind of category of death comes. But I think if we look at it in the sense of this, that humanity is kind of, which again is connected with sin, in the garden, in the sense that the reason we're going to die is because they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, meaning that they could no longer eat from the tree of life. So because we are inherently part of this life and death cycle, whereas God is the ever-living, uncreated one, that we have this tension that we live in. So so all of these things kind of draw attention to that. And I think that's part of the goal is, again, it's just, I think there's something that we're supposed to not lose the weight of the fact that we are serving the God of the universe who's created all things and yet himself is uncreated, and we are very finite. So in some sense, I think this ritual purity draws attention to the fact that we are finite, that we are going to die, that we, and so it just brings this awareness. Sometimes I think about all these things and I'm like, man, these people had to be like really self-aware about a lot of things. And again, unto this community aspect of, their personal state impacts people around them and impacts the ability for sacrifice and worship to God to be happening, whether they're able to personally participate or make sure that someone else is. So I think there's something really beautiful about that too, but it does bring a lot of attention to a lot of things that sometimes I don't know that we in our modern world pay so much attention to. Which I think is sometimes why it's so striking to us. And like we think about this reality and it's like, wow, like these people like really had to like think about how their personal actions or their just personal state of being impacted the rest of the people around them. So I don't know. I think it's really interesting and really, I think it's really interesting to think about. So let's see, let's move on. Let's move towards a little bit how Yeshua kind of deals with some of these things. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to. There's something. Okay. So before we jump to that, just to like summarize just a little bit. So at the end of chapter 15, which is the end of our portion this week, we kind of get this great summary statement about everything that's been talked about up to this point in these portions. So in verse 31, Leviticus 15:31, it says, "So you are to keep Bnei Israel separate from their uncleanness, so they will not die by their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle that is in their midst. This is the Torah for the one who has a discharge, or for one who has an emission of semen, which causes him to become unclean, as well as for her who has her period of nidah, and for the men and women who just had a discharge, or for the one who lives with her who is unclean." So it kind of is bringing all this around to the point that it's all about. It's also that they will not die in the presence of a holy God, and so that the presence of their holy God can stay. So, okay, so one other example before we move on to how Yeshua interacts with some of these things. I think what we see play out through the rest of the Tanakh is Israel's wrestle with this system, right? And we've talked about before, like, it's like, especially when we get into the periods of the kings, the kings that are obedient, things go well, and the kings that are disobedient, things don't go so well. And I think that it's similar to this. And so it becomes, when there's also this idea that the priesthood is responsible for helping everybody else know and understand what they're to do. So the one example, like in Ezekiel, the prophets show us several times when the priests neglect their God-given duty to instruct Israel in the law, and this is even quoting Ezekiel 7:26, that says the law perishes from the priest. And so there's this responsibility of the priesthood to help instruct the people, right? In addition to running the tabernacle or the temple system, the priests also are kind of the teachers and the ones who are supposed to be helping the rest of the community understand what is expected of them. Sometimes there can be, some people interpret some of these things as rejection of the purity system or priestly authority, but that doesn't seem to be the case. The prophets are actually calling them back to a higher standard. So they're calling them back. I like how this book says this. It says, "For the prophets, the proposed solution to failure within the ritual purity system was not the abandonment of the system, but a more accurate delineation and maintenance of the boundaries." So there's actually this call back to obedience and to living out this system as God has instructed it. And again, looking at this idea of, like, it's not just about keeping the law, it's about having God's presence in your midst, and it's about their relationship. And there's also this idea of, like, so there, even though there's this clean and unclean, pure and impure, whatever, however you want to say that, reality, and it's like there's right, if you're unclean, there's a way to be clean again, right? But that doesn't make what makes you unclean go away, which is interesting, right? So it's almost like it's this maintenance system, not necessarily this, it's not necessarily taking away some of those things. So, but when we look at Yeshua, so we'll jump to a couple of examples. Okay, let's start out with, we're going to go to the woman with the issue of blood after this, but let's start with in Mark 1, verse 40. So this is a man with skin disease that comes to Yeshua and says that if you are willing, you can make me clean. And in verse 41 it says, "Moved with compassion, Yeshua stretched out his hand and touched him. He said, 'I am willing, be cleansed.' Immediately Tza'arat left, or the skin disease left him, and he was cleaned. Yeshua sent him away at once, sternly warning him, and he said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the Cohen, the priest, then for your cleansing, offer what Moses commanded as a testimony to them." So this is an example where Yeshua essentially heals this man, but then sends him to the temple, right, to be declared clean by the priest. Why would you do that? It's the law. But wait, I thought Yeshua came to abolish the law. Sorry,
He came to fulfill the law.
He came to fulfill the law. I know, I'm being kind of silly. Yeah, so he's operating within this system, right? Because and think about the person too. Think about this person with this disease. What does it mean for them if the priest declares them clean? They can come back into community, right? So, and yet there's this kind of extra element that comes when Yeshua is part of the story, right? Because he is the one true God, and so he's this example of, like, he is the embodiment of holiness, and he's the embodiment of purity, and so that force can go out from him and can deal with the problem, right? And it doesn't give us a lot of detail here, but some think that this man had been living with this disease for a long time, and so again, he would have been out of community because of this disease that he had. So so he heals it. So let's look at.
I love the fact that he made the man clean, but by touching or healing that man, he didn't become unclean.
Right. Which is really interesting. And I'm trying to remember where it was. I was going to go look it up and I forgot. There's a verse that we talked about a couple weeks ago, that it talks about the holiness, whatever touches it becomes holy, of some of the tabernacle items, and I don't remember exactly where that verse was. Why am I thinking past it? Remind me where the woman of the issue of blood is. John. Is it?
I didn't know the address.
Mark 5:21, Matthew 9:20.
Okay. John, are you thinking of the woman in caught in adultery? She's in John 8. Which that's where I was thinking too, and then I was like, no, that's the wrong one. Sorry, Mark what?
Mark 5:21.
Thank you. Okay. Okay. So yeah, Mark 5, starting in 24. So she had this issue for 12 years, suffered under many doctors, spent all that she had, gets worse, and in verse 28, for she kept saying, "If I touch even his clothes, I shall be healed." And so right away the blood flow stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed from her disease. At once Yeshua, knowing in himself that power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And the disciples just responded, "You see the crowd pressing upon you and say, 'Who touched me?' But he kept looking around to see who had done this." But the woman, scared and shaking, knowing that what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in shalom and be healed from your disease." And then we go back to this story of this another example of dealing with impurity and the death of a child. But we'll stick with one thing at a time. So so again, he has this power that goes out from him, right? So his power, the holiness in him, the presence of God in him goes out, and he does not become unclean, but she becomes healed. So, so there's this like added element that with Yeshua, right? Because the purification processes that happen in the tabernacle, or whatever, or that you're unclean until evening and then you bathe and wash your clothes and you're clean, is this this picture that you can be made clean again, and it's not by and it's because of God that we become clean or that we become holy. It's not we have these practices that point to that help us interact with that, but it's like just in the same way that it's like it's not like when we look at atonement through blood, it's not really that the blood takes on the sin and that's what takes away. It's that there's this price, there's this sacrifice, and there's this atonement that comes from God. So Yeshua, being the embodiment of God's presence, has this power and presence to go out and overcome this state of impurity without becoming impure himself. Yeah.
I'm sorry, where does it say that he did not become unclean?
I mean, he doesn't go through any of in none of the situations where he approaches someone unclean does it talk about him having to become pure. So, or to become clean. So it's talking about this power going out of him. And so it's this, it seems one directional. So most scholars understand that I guess I'm not saying necessarily that it was impossible for him to become unclean necessarily, but it doesn't seem that in these cases that he is, because he just goes on and keeps doing what he was doing. And if he were unclean, then he would have to also stop and go through all these things himself. Yeah, especially, and even going back to the one in Mark 1 with the man with the skin disease, like he knows he has healed him, and of course the man doesn't obey, but he says, don't go proclaiming all of this, it's not time yet, but go show yourself to the priest and let the priest declare you clean. But it doesn't say anything about Yeshua having to go through and be cleansed himself. So most of what I've read is all with this understanding that Yeshua's power is overcoming and bringing healing and I don't know. Yeah, healing, I guess, or resolving the state of impurity, especially in these cases where it seems like this is not like with this woman. This is not just a normal, right? This is not like a normal monthly cycle. Like this is abnormal. This is an extreme situation, and so his power is intervening there, and his power is greater than the uncleanness of the woman.
Well, and then the issue with the woman, it's cleansing the whole community because she shouldn't have been there.
Mm-hmm.
She was sinning or making everybody else unclean.
She was potentially.
But
It
just
doesn't.
by
We
her
don't have enough
presence,
information to know.
Because Peter says, well, everybody's pushing in on you, which would imply that everybody was pushing in on her as well, and if they were touching her, they were becoming unclean
Yeah.
also. And it doesn't say that, like, the whole crowd had to go
Right.
have the separation and become clean.
Right. Yeah, and we don't have a lot of detail about that. So.
And we have to remember that the issue of cleanliness and uncleanliness is about going and being able to make sacrifices at the temple.
Right.
It's not about daily living, and like it's not a sin to be unclean.
Right.
So that like there's a lot of things that would have made a lot of people unclean on a regular basis.
Right.
The idea was that when we come to worship a holy God, that we would present ourselves clean and holy. So even in that circumstances, like that was part of the issue, was that a sector of the Jewish leaders were taking it to an extreme and saying everybody has to be clean all the time, and that's where there was an issue as well. So there's, like Evan was saying, a lot of circumstances surrounding, whether she would have been missing it, it would have been a big deal or not.
Right.
I think the issue of leprosy is a different thing, and even the way that it's described in Torah, right? Because that's something that's contagious, and I think there was ways that the priest knew whether it was contagious or not contagious, and how they would declare whether they're allowed to even be in community. So it's not, there's even layers of uncleanliness.
Right.
Not everything was this like stay away, and there's some things that were like they would have to yell unclean, unclean, so that they wouldn't contagion anybody. But
yeah, and even so there, and I think it's also like part of the social structures that had come was because of some of this heightened expectation of purity in the everyday, which again, going back to our discussion that we had at the beginning about the holy and the common, it's like most things are common, right? And that doesn't mean that they're bad. In the same way, being impure doesn't mean that it is not bad unless you're trying to go into the holy place. But I think that in some ways, a lot of, like Yeshua's response is that he's not shying away from that. And a lot of the accounts that we have in the Gospels are showing, are demonstrating certain aspects of his power, his what he's doing as the living God on the earth. So, like, again, we're not necessarily seeing every minute of his everyday life, but we're seeing these situations and these examples, especially like the way, Mark kind of stacks them up one after another almost, of all these issues of he's not shying away, but because even the woman with the issue of blood, he's in the middle of going to see someone who's dying, who dies and then is resurrected, which is another, a dead body is another thing that makes you unclean. So he's not shying away from these things, which again was part of some aspects of, I'm not going to say all, we have lots of different groups of Jewish people at the time, but it was becoming a more and more common practice of like, if you are unclean or even possibly you have to stay away from everyone else, which is very isolating, and Yeshua's kind of coming against that. And yes, he's bringing healing at this. There's this healing aspect, which is another factor to all of this. But he's also like, I think he's demonstrating the true compassion, I think, of this system of ritual purity, in that it's not meant to isolate people to the extent that some of the leadership was suggesting. Because even looking at, and we're not going to go through all of it, because it's too long, but it's even an extension of, it's not necessarily about, well, let me back up. So Acts 10, when Peter gets this vision, right, of the unclean animals, just means that he's allowed to eat whatever he wants, right? No. And how do we know that? Because he keeps saying, I don't understand what this means. And so ultimately, the Lord gives him the interpretation and says that don't call unclean what I have called clean, meaning Gentiles. So this kind of circles back to our Jew Gentile, because of this issue of cleanliness, Gentiles were just categorically considered unclean, which is fair because they're not living in this same system and this following all of the same laws. And so that meant that Jewish people were not interacting with them, or wouldn't go into their homes, wouldn't have table fellowship with them, wouldn't all these different things. And so they were just kind of kept separate. And what the Lord is saying is like, no, you can't, if I've called these people to be part of my family and part of my kingdom, you can't call them unclean. And demonstrates this by the fact, right, that the Holy Spirit falls on them And they're like, well, now I guess we have to baptize them because we have to immerse them because they have the Holy Spirit. And they didn't think that's why I would say that Acts is, they decide how they're going to spread the gospel and the Holy Spirit shows up and messes up their plan.
Yeah.
But basically they recognize the power of God, right? Which I think is a similar type of power that Yeshua is demonstrating when this holiness or this, he has the power to overcome the situation that's going on with whatever person he's dealing with. I think we have a similar thing happening when the Holy Spirit is pouring out on the Gentiles. That's maybe overgeneralizing a little bit, but my point is that there's a time and a place for this ritual purity, and again, I do think that there's something valuable to the level of awareness that it brings, and just being aware of your state of being, and how that impacts, that can even impact the people around you, and also it's not meant to bring division and to isolate unnecessarily beyond the requirements actually given, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's fine if Yeshua, the Father gave him this power that he never became unclean, but I think it's also fine if he was unclean. Because, like we've been saying, uncleanness is not sin. But if he went into the temple in a state of impurity, then he would have sinned. So you have all the mikvahs, obviously around the temple. And as I understand in first century Judaism, there's this real emphasis, and maybe it was the Pharisees particularly, emphasized ritual purity all the time, whether you're going to the temple or not. So there's mikvahs, way up in the north part of the country and different places, so that at least the aspect of going through, in terms of cleansing, in terms of living water aspect of it. I'm not sure about the leprosy thing. So, I think just to emphasize that being ritually impure was not sin, was not signifying that you were sinning. So I would see that, it'd be amazing, it'd be great that he never was impure because the Father gave him, but he was fully human. So
Right.
I think he had contact. The circumstances as a human, he would have become impure. But I think it's fine if, just because of his sinless nature, God gave him the power to never become impure. But at the same time, if he was unclean at times, I think that's fine too.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things. I think it's hard. It's one of those. It's like it is hard for us to wrap our minds around the fact that he's fully God and fully man, because it's like, in what circumstance? Which one wins in what circumstance? And I don't know that we can always parse that out, and I don't think we have to. So I can see what you're saying. I think my perspective has always been that in this sense, he is acting as the embodiment of God, and so would not become unclean. But I don't know. I can see some of the arguments, but I do think that there's this. It's how do we hold the tension of the fully God, fully man, and we have a really hard time knowing how to. We have the natural tendency to want to swing one way or the other, which is, I think, just because that's how our brains are capable of trying to process that. So yeah, I don't know. And yeah, there was the idea that you should remain in this, this ritual purity, but I don't necessarily think that carrying that out to the diaspora was necessarily fits the intention of how the system was designed, because it's about coming into the presence of God. So there's a lot of different aspects we could talk about in that, but we are running out of time. So I just realized what time it was. But all this to say, I have been really fascinated by, and again, I've just barely gotten into this book a little bit, but I'm really fascinated by this, how this is looking. And I think that I wanted to share one other thing. Let's see if I can remember, if I can find it. But basically, there's this idea. I don't know where the quote is, so I'll just summarize. So basically, yeah, we can pick apart, all the different parts of this, and we can look at all the different facets, and it's super interesting. I'm not saying we don't look at some of the specifics and we don't ask the questions and all these things. But I know where it is. So he goes into this discussion about one of the sections I read, which we don't have time to get into right now, is about this childbirth, and there's this argument about whether or not the baby is unclean, which is super interesting. And in some sense, I'm like, it doesn't matter. Because the mom is unclean and the baby's going to be with the mom. So I'm like, I don't know that it matters. But it's a really interesting argument. But we're not gonna chase that rabbit right now. But I think this point is really good, is that this is a good perspective to keep as we try to look at some of the details. He says, Leviticus is not an exhaustive description of all the purity laws enjoined upon Israel. Rather, the priestly writer lays out a system of purity that is at times elliptical, requiring understanding of the whole in order to apply appropriately to individual cases. So it's giving us this idea of like, we need to look at the whole, sometimes we can like laser focus in on this one little detail, and how does this one instruction play out, and how do we apply it to all these things, and what about this, or what if we put all these factors into it? But right, the Torah isn't quite that, right? It's not the bullet point of, in this situation you do this, this, and this. It's this body of, this is how you function so that you can have me in your midst. And so it doesn't give you all the specifics, but it gives you an overarching system. So the more we understand the whole system and the whole cycle of everything, the more we start to see how it can apply in different situations. And I think it takes us a very long time to really be able to do that, because it is a system that is so different than what we're used to in our lives. But I just have appreciated seeing how I've enjoyed it, even in the last couple of years, and then kind of starting to dive into a little bit more specifically to some of these situations, of seeing how Yeshua kind of embodies and works within and not in contrast to these different situations when it comes to ritual purity. That he does bring healing and compassion into it, but it's, I think, in the spirit of how it was originally intended. I don't think it's that we were given this legalism and then it becomes compassionate when Yeshua comes. I think that he's connecting back to the heart of the Father in how it was originally implemented. So, Shabbat Shalom. Huh?
What book is it?
This book is called Jesus and the Forces of Death. Yeah. It's great. Really enjoyed it. All right. Well,
Thanks so much.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.